The sweet and putrid smell hung in the air, a nauseating mix of floral perfume and decay. Detective Jack Harrison took a deep breath, trying to keep the bile from rising in his throat as he observed the scene before him. The garden, once a refuge of vibrant colors and life, was now a macabre tableau of death and distorted beauty. The victim, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Thompson, lay buried up to her neck in her own flower bed. Her face, frozen in an expression of sheer terror, was framed by a meticulous arrangement of blood-red roses and bone-white lilies. The woman's glazed eyes seemed to stare into the void, as if still witnessing the horror of her last moments. Jack approached cautiously, his shoes sinking into the damp earth. The forensic expert, a thin, pale man named Dr. Miller, was crouched beside the body, examining the flowers with an expression of morbid fascination. "I've never seen anything like this," Miller murmured, his voice trembling with a mix of excitement and disgust. "The flowers, they were planted after she was buried. They grew through her, Jack, through her." The detective felt a shiver run down his spine. He forced himself to look closer and saw, with growing horror, that Miller was right. Delicate roots had intertwined with the decaying flesh, creating a grotesque fusion of life and death. "How long has she been here?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse. "Judging by the state of decomposition, I'd say about 2 weeks," Miller replied. "But the flowers, they shouldn't be this developed. It's as if they've grown in days, not weeks." Jack frowned, his mind struggling to process the information. This was no ordinary murder, that much was clear. There was something deeply disturbing about the killer's precision and patience, the way he had turned an act of violence into a macabre work of art. As the forensic technicians began carefully excavating around the body, Jack took a walk around the garden. Each step revealed new horticultural wonders, rare and exotic species that seemed out of place in this quiet suburb. He wondered if Sarah Thompson had been an avid gardener, or if these additions were the work of the killer. A movement out of the corner of his eye caught his attention. Turning quickly, Jack saw a pale face watching from the window of the neighboring house. It was an elderly woman, her eyes wide with fear and morbid fascination. When she realized she had been noticed, she quickly closed the curtains. Jack made a mental note to question the neighbors later. Someone must have seen or heard something. Such an elaborate murder couldn't have gone completely unnoticed. Turning his attention back to the victim's house, Jack noticed something odd. The back door was ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. He approached cautiously, his hand instinctively going to the gun in his holster. "Miller," he called over his shoulder, "have you and your team checked inside the house?" The forensic expert looked up, surprised. "Not yet. We were waiting for the investigation team to arrive." Jack nodded, a sense of apprehension growing in his chest. With a quick motion, he drew his gun and pushed the door open, stepping into the dim interior of the house. The inside was a study in contrasts. The living room was immaculate, every surface gleaming with an almost supernatural shine. But as Jack ventured deeper into the house, the smell of decomposition grew stronger. He followed the odor to the kitchen, his heart pounding in his chest. The refrigerator door was slightly open, a dark, viscous liquid seeping out to form a puddle on the linoleum floor. With a quick motion, Jack flung the refrigerator door open and recoiled in horror. Where fresh produce and leftovers should have been, there were pots filled with soil, and from each pot sprouted flowers, the same blood-red roses and bone-white lilies that adorned the body in the garden. But the true horror lay at the back of the refrigerator. Nestled among the pots were human organs, carefully preserved and labeled. Hearts, kidneys, livers, each serving as a macabre form of fertilizer for the flowers growing above them. Jack staggered back, his stomach churning. He had seen many crime scenes in his career, but nothing compared to this. This was not just the work of a killer. It was the creation of a monster, someone who viewed death as a form of perverse art. As he struggled to regain his composure, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Beautiful, aren't they? The flowers, I mean. They thrive on suffering, you know. The more painful the death, the more vibrant they bloom. And there are so many gardens in this neighborhood waiting to be cultivated. Jack dropped the phone, his blood turning to ice. The killer wasn't just watching. He was communicating, taunting. And worse, he was promising more deaths. With trembling hands, Jack picked up the phone again and called headquarters. "This is Detective Harrison," he said, his voice tense. "We need reinforcements, lots of reinforcements. We have a serial killer on our hands, and he's just getting started." As he waited for the reinforcements to arrive, Jack returned to the garden, his eyes scanning the neighborhood. Identical suburban houses lined the street, each with its own well-tended garden. How many of these gardens hid dark secrets? How many victims had yet to be discovered? The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. As darkness approached, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Somewhere, hidden among the flowers and shadows, the killer was waiting, planning his next move. And as night fell over the seemingly tranquil neighborhood, the air grew heavy with the scent of flowers and the metallic tang of fear. The hunt had only just begun, and Jack knew that before it was over, more blood would be shed to feed the killer's gardens. The following days were a whirlwind of frantic activity and mounting terror. The news of Sarah Thompson's murder spread through the neighborhood like a virus, infecting every conversation, every glance exchanged between once friendly neighbors. Fear hung in the air, as palpable as the scent of the flowers that now seemed to bloom in every garden with an almost obscene abundance. Jack Harrison barely slept, his dreams haunted by visions of buried bodies and flowers growing through decaying flesh. Each morning brought him back to reality, a reality that was quickly becoming as disturbing as his nightmares. 3 days after Sarah's body was discovered, another victim was found. This time, it was a middle-aged man named Robert Callahan, an accountant who lived alone 2 streets down. His body was found under eerily similar circumstances, buried up to his neck in his own garden, surrounded by an elaborate arrangement of purple orchids and yellow daffodils. Jack was on the scene within minutes, his stomach churning with the macabre familiarity of it all. Dr. Miller was already there, his face pale and tense as he examined the body. "It's the same M.O., Miller said quietly as Jack approached. "But there's something different this time. Look at the flowers, Jack. They're different." The detective leaned in closer, forcing himself to look past the horror of the decomposing flesh. Miller was right. The flowers were different, not just in species, but in arrangement. While the flowers around Sarah Thompson had been arranged in a circular pattern, these formed a kind of 5-pointed star. "What do you think it means?" Jack asked, his mind racing with dark possibilities. Miller shook his head. "I don't know, but I'm sure it's not random. Nothing about these murders is random." As the forensic team worked to carefully exhume the body, Jack began to search the garden for clues. It was then that he noticed something strange, a small business card partially buried in the soil near the body. With a racing heart, Jack carefully dug out the card. It was simple, white with delicate green lettering. "Gardens of Eden, where beauty blooms eternally, Frank Bloom, owner and chief florist." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. This was the first solid lead they had, a tangible link between the victims and a potential suspect. He quickly bagged the card as evidence and ordered his team to investigate everything about Frank Bloom and his shop. As the detectives combed through Robert Callahan's house, Jack couldn't help but notice the similarities to the previous crime scene. The house was immaculate, almost sterilized in its cleanliness, and once again the refrigerator contained a macabre arrangement of flower pots and preserved human organs. It was as they were about to leave that Jack noticed something they had missed before, a small notebook hidden behind a stack of accounting books. Flipping through it quickly, the detective felt his blood run cold. It was a journal, and the most recent entries detailed a series of secret meetings with someone identified only as F. "Met with F again today," one entry read. "He has incredible knowledge about flowers. Said he could show me rare species that no one else in the neighborhood has. Looking forward to our next gardening session." Jack snapped the notebook shut, his mind whirling. F. Frank Bloom. It couldn't be a coincidence. Back at the station, Jack dove into the investigation of Frank Bloom. The man seemed to be a model citizen at first glance. owner of a successful florist shop, active member of the community, no criminal record. But the more Jack dug, the more inconsistencies he found. Frank Bloom had moved to the town just 5 years ago, opening his shop shortly thereafter. Before that, there was virtually no record of him. It was as if the man had appeared out of nowhere, bringing with him an encyclopedic knowledge of botany and a talent for cultivating the rarest and most exotic flowers. Deciding it was time for a direct confrontation, Jack headed to Frank Bloom's store, Garden of Eden. The shop was on a quiet street, its facade covered in flowering vines and the display window showcasing stunning arrangements that seemed almost unreal in their beauty. A bell tinkled softly as Jack entered, and the intense aroma of hundreds of different flowers hit him like a wave. For a moment he felt dizzy, almost intoxicated by the fragrance. "Can I help you?" The soft voice made Jack turn around. Frank Bloom stood behind the counter, a middle-aged man with gray hair and piercing blue eyes. He smiled gently, but there was something in his eyes that made Jack shiver. "Detective Jack Harrison," he introduced himself, showing his badge. "I'd like to ask you some questions about two of your clients, Sarah Thompson and Robert Callahan." Frank's smile didn't falter, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition? Fear? Excitement? Jack couldn't decipher it. "What a terrible tragedy," Frank said, his voice laden with sadness. "They were wonderful customers, both passionate about gardening. Sarah, in particular, had a special talent for orchids." Jack watched Frank closely as he spoke, looking for signs of nervousness or guilt. But the florist seemed perfectly composed, his expression a mask of polite concern. "When was the last time you saw them?" Jack asked, keeping his tone casual. Frank frowned as if straining to remember. "Sarah was here about 3 weeks ago, buying fertilizer for her roses. Robert, well, it must be almost a month. He was interested in some of our more exotic species." Jack nodded slowly. The dates matched the estimated time of death. "And you didn't notice anything unusual about them? No strange behavior, no suspicious visitors?" Frank shook his head. "Nothing that I can remember, but, Detective, this is a quiet neighborhood. We all know each other. It's hard to imagine anyone here could do something so horrible." There was a note of sincerity in Frank's voice that made Jack hesitate. Could this gentle and articulate man really be the monster they were looking for? But then Jack noticed something, a slight tremor in Frank's hands as he arranged a vase of flowers on the counter. And there was something else, a nearly imperceptible smell beneath the perfume of the flowers, something metallic and familiar. "Mr. Bloom," Jack said abruptly, "would you mind if we took a look at your greenhouse?" Frank's smile wavered for a moment, but he quickly composed himself. "Of course, Detective, this way." He led Jack through the store to a door at the back. When he opened it, the detective was hit by a wave of humid heat and an even more intense aroma of flowers. The greenhouse was a labyrinth of green and color, with row upon row of exotic plants. Jack walked slowly, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Then he saw it. Almost hidden behind a tangle of climbing vines, a small freezer. The kind of freezer that could easily store human organs. "What do you keep in that freezer, Mr. Bloom?" Jack asked, his voice tense. Frank seemed to freeze for a moment, his eyes widening slightly. "Oh, that? Just some rare bulbs that need specific temperatures to germinate. Nothing special." But Jack was already moving towards the freezer, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel Frank moving behind him, approaching quickly. Just as Jack was about to open the freezer, he felt a sharp pain at the back of his head. The world spun, darkened, and then nothing. When Jack awoke, the first thing he noticed was the smell. Damp earth and the sweet, cloying scent of flowers. He tried to move but found he was tied up, his arms and legs firmly bound. Slowly, consciousness returned, and with it came the horror of realization. He was lying in a shallow pit, the cold earth pressing against his back. Above him, Frank Bloom smiled, a shovel in one hand and a bouquet of flowers in the other. "Ah, Detective Harrison," Frank said, his voice soft and almost affectionate. "You really shouldn't have been so curious. But don't worry, you will be my masterpiece. The flowers that will grow from you will be the most beautiful of all." Jack struggled against his bonds, panic rising in his chest. "Why?" he managed to choke out. "Why are you doing this?" Frank's smile turned into something darker, more dangerous. "Why? Because true beauty can only be born from suffering, Detective. Every person in this negligent and selfish neighborhood hides sordid secrets behind their perfect facades. I'm just exposing those secrets, turning their rot into something beautiful." He crouched beside the pit, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light. "You see, Detective, every flower tells a story. Sarah's roses spoke of her secret passion for married men. Robert's orchids revealed his greed and fraud. And yours, well, yours will speak of your obsession, your inability to let go of the past." Jack felt a chill of fear run down his spine. How did Frank know about his past? About the cases that haunted him, the victims he couldn't save? Frank began to shovel dirt over Jack, the weight gradually increasing on his chest. "Don't worry, Detective. Your death won't be in vain. You will nurture something beautiful, something eternal." As the dirt covered his face, Jack's last thoughts were of his team. Would they find him? Or would he become just another macabre garden in this seemingly perfect neighborhood? Darkness enveloped him, and Jack felt the roots begin to intertwine with his body. His last conscious thought was that, even in death, the hunt wasn't over. Somehow, he would find a way to expose the truth. And as Jack's consciousness faded, the first flowers began to bloom above his buried body. Lilies white as bone and deep purple irises, a silent testament to another life lost to the killer gardener. But the story didn't end there. As Frank Bloom returned to his shop, satisfied with his latest creation, he didn't notice the figure watching him from the shadows. A young detective, Jack's partner, who had followed her instincts and tracked her missing partner to the flower shop. With a heavy heart and determination burning in her eyes, she pulled out her phone and made a silent call. "Central, this is Detective Emily Hawthorne. I need backup at Garden of Eden florist. Suspect located and—" She hesitated, her voice faltering for a moment. "And I believe we have an officer down." As the sirens began to sound in the distance, Emily knew the real battle was just beginning. Frank Bloom might be in custody, but the secrets buried in that neighborhood were just starting to come to light. And she vowed, for the memory of her partner, that she wouldn't rest until every dark secret was exposed to the light of day. The neighborhood that once seemed like a suburban paradise now revealed itself as a flowered hell, each garden a potential grave, each flower a possible coded message of horror. And as night fell over the silent streets, the scent of flowers carried with it not just beauty, but the distant echo of silenced screams and deadly secrets yet to be unearthed. The weeks following Frank Bloom's arrest were a whirlwind of horrific revelations and long-buried secrets coming to light. The neighborhood that once seemed like a suburban oasis now revealed itself as a labyrinth of lies, each house hiding its own terrible shadows. Detective Emily Hawthorne led the investigation now, driven by a toxic mix of grief and relentless determination. The loss of her partner, Jack Harrison, weighed on her like a shroud. Each new macabre detail she uncovered a dagger in her heart. Jack's body was found exactly where Frank had said it would be, buried in a remote corner of the greenhouse, already with the first shoots of lilies and irises emerging from the freshly turned soil. The exhumation was a nightmare that would haunt Emily for years, her partner's contorted face a silent accusation that she had arrived too late. But there was no time for prolonged mourning. Each day, new victims were discovered, each garden in the neighborhood a potential crime scene. Emily and her team worked tirelessly, uncovering not just bodies, but also the sordid secrets that Frank Bloom had used to select his victims. Sarah Thompson, the first known victim, was not just the devoted wife and loving mother everyone thought. Her rose garden hid a web of affairs with married men from the neighborhood, each flower representing a different lover. Robert Callahan, the seemingly bored accountant, was involved in a massive fraud scheme, siphoning millions from charity funds into offshore accounts. His exotic orchids were bought with dirty money, each petal a testament to his greed. And so it went on. Each new body unearthed, revealing another dark secret, another double life carefully hidden behind polite smiles and well-kept white fences. But it was during Frank Bloom's interrogation that the true depth of the horror was revealed. The florist, now stripped of his gentle facade, spoke with an almost religious fervor about his work. "You don't understand," he told Emily, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light. "I'm not a murderer. I'm an artist, a force of nature. I just expose the truth that's already there, transforming hidden rot into visible beauty." Emily struggled to maintain her composure, her revulsion battling with a morbid curiosity. "And the flowers? What do they mean?" Frank smiled, a gesture that sent shivers down Emily's spine. "Every flower tells a story, detective. Roses speak of passion and betrayal. Orchids of lust and greed. Lilies, lilies are for fallen avengers, those who dug too deep." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But there is more, much more. Every arrangement is a message, a code. Unravel it, and you'll uncover the true extent of the rot in this seemingly perfect neighborhood." Frank's words haunted Emily as she returned to work. She began to see patterns where there had been none, hidden meanings in every petal and leaf. She spent sleepless nights studying botany, floral symbolism, even numerology, desperate to decipher the message Frank claimed to have left. It was during one of these sleepless nights that she made the connection. The floral arrangements weren't random. They formed a map. A map that led not only to the already discovered victims, but to dozens of other locations scattered throughout the neighborhood and beyond. With her heart racing, Emily gathered her team. They started digging, following Frank's macabre floral map. And with each new excavation, the horror only grew. Bodies were found in public parks, under the foundations of newly built buildings, even in the local cemetery, hidden in long-abandoned family graves. The number of victims rose from dozens to hundreds, spanning not just the neighborhood, but the entire city and beyond. The media went into a frenzy, dubbing the case the gardener's harvest. Panic spread as people everywhere began to look at their gardens with new eyes, fearing what might be buried beneath the seemingly innocent flowers. But for Emily, the real horror wasn't in the bodies or the flowers. It was in the secrets each new discovery revealed. Corrupt politicians, dishonest businessmen, pedophile priests. It seemed that no one was above suspicion, that every pillar of the community hid some form of rot. And at every crime scene, with each new horror unearthed, Emily couldn't help but think of Jack. Her partner had died trying to expose the truth, and now it was up to her to finish what he had started. As the investigation deepened, Emily began to notice something disturbing. Some of the more recent victims didn't fit the pattern established by Frank Bloom. Their gardens were cruder, less artistic. It was as if someone was trying to imitate the gardener's work, but without his skill or twisted vision. The possibility of a copycat sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Had Frank Bloom's legacy inspired others to follow in his grotesque footsteps? It was at this point that Emily received a call that would change everything. It was from Dr. Miller, the forensic expert who had worked on the initial cases. "Detective Hawthorne," Miller's voice was tense, almost frantic. "You need to come to the morgue immediately. There's something you need to see." Intrigued and apprehensive, Emily rushed to the morgue. Miller awaited her, his face pale and tense. "It's about the latest victims," he said, leading her to the autopsy room. "There's something different about them, something that doesn't make sense." He pulled back the sheet from one of the bodies, and Emily had to stifle a scream. The corpse was covered in tiny sprouts, minuscule flowers emerging directly from the decomposing flesh. "This is impossible," Emily whispered, her stomach churning. "Frank's flowers were always planted around the bodies, never like this." Miller nodded grimly. "Exactly, and there's more. The DNA analysis of these flowers. They don't match any known species. It's like they're some kind of hybrid, something that shouldn't exist in nature." Emily's mind whirled, trying to process this new horrifying information. What exactly had Frank Bloom created in his greenhouse? And more importantly, who was continuing his work? Determined to find answers, Emily returned to the prison where Frank was held. But upon arrival, she was met with yet another shock. Frank's cell was empty, the bars covered by a blooming vine that seemed to have sprouted from nowhere. And on the wall, written in what looked like a mixture of blood and plant sap, was a message. The seed has been planted. The harvest has only just begun. Emily's heart sank. Frank Bloom had escaped, and with him, the horror he had begun was about to flourish on an unimaginable scale. In the days that followed, reports began to come in from all over the country. Gardens appearing overnight, flowers of unknown species sprouting in improbable locations. And with each new garden, more bodies were discovered. Emily and her team worked tirelessly, following every lead, investigating every new suspicious growth. But it was like trying to contain a flood with bare hands. Frank Bloom's legacy had spread like a virus, infecting the very ground beneath their feet. And somewhere, hidden among the shadows and petals, Frank Bloom watched his creation spread, a twisted smile on his lips as he contemplated the new era of horror he had ushered in. For Emily, the battle had only just begun. She knew she couldn't rest until Frank was recaptured, until every one of his seeds was uprooted. But as she looked at the horizon, seeing the first signs of strange, beautiful flowers beginning to sprout in the cracks of the asphalt, she couldn't help but wonder, was it already too late? Had Frank Bloom's garden of evil taken root too deeply to be eradicated? As night fell over the city, the sweet and nauseating scent of unknown flowers hung in the air, a silent promise that the horrors unearthed were only the beginning. The true harvest, with all its unspeakable terrors, was yet to come. And somewhere, hidden among the shadows and petals, Frank Bloom smiled, knowing that his greatest work was just beginning to bloom. The rain fell relentlessly over the city, turning the streets into dark, winding rivers. Detective Max Holloway watched through the foggy window of his decrepit office, fingers drumming impatiently on the worn desk. The phone rang, slicing through the silence like a knife. "Holloway," he answered, his voice hoarse from cigarette smoke and sleepless nights. "Mr. Holloway," the voice on the other end was soft, almost a whisper. "I need your services. It's about my brother Thomas Reeves." Max felt a chill run down his spine. Thomas Reeves. The journalist's name had dominated headlines for weeks. Found dead in his apartment, apparently by suicide. But rumors spread quickly. Reeves was about to expose something big, something that could shake the foundations of the city. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am," Max said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "But the police have already concluded the investigation. It was ruled a suicide." A muffled sound, something between a bitter laugh and a sob. "Do you really believe that, Detective? Thomas he would never do that. Not when he was so close to exposing the truth." Max closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of curiosity and a sense of justice battling against his instinct for self-preservation. He knew he should refuse the case, knew that messing with Reeves's death was like poking a hornet's nest. But something in the woman's voice, the raw pain and iron determination, touched him. "All right," he finally said. "Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. at Café Noir on 5th Avenue. Bring everything you have on your brother's work." The call ended, and Max found himself staring at his reflection in the dark window. What was he getting himself into? The next morning, Café Noir was nearly empty when Max walked in, the doorbell chiming softly. He immediately spotted the woman sitting in a distant corner, dark hair, eyes hollow from sleepless nights, hands clutching a thick folder. "Mrs. Reeves," Max greeted, sliding into the seat opposite her. "Sarah," she corrected, her eyes nervously scanning the cafe. "Sarah Reeves." Without another word, she pushed the folder toward him. Max opened it carefully, his eyes widening as he absorbed the contents. Newspaper clippings, blurred photographs, scribbled notes in frantic handwriting, all pointing to something called the Order of Eternal Twilight. "Thomas was investigating this for months," Sarah whispered, leaning forward. "A secret society," he said. "Powerful people, dark rituals. He was about to expose everything, and then—" Her voice broke, and Max saw tears shining in her eyes. He nodded silently, flipping through more documents. Names jumped off the pages. Prominent politicians, CEOs, even a Supreme Court judge, all supposedly members of this order. "This is explosive," Max murmured, feeling the weight of the information. If this is true— It is true, Sarah insisted, her voice gaining strength. Thomas had proof, concrete proof, but it disappeared from his apartment after his death. The police say they found nothing, but I know he had it. Max closed the folder, his mind racing with the implications. If half of what was in there was true, he would be tangling with some of the most powerful and dangerous people in the city, maybe the country. Mrs. Reeves, Sarah, he began, choosing his words carefully. Do you understand what you're asking of me? If I take this case, I'll be putting my life at risk, and possibly yours too. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and determination. My brother died for this, Mr. Holloway. He died trying to expose the truth. I won't let it be in vain. Max held her gaze for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, with a deep sigh, he extended his hand. All right, Sarah, I'll take the case. But you need to understand one thing. From now on, things are going to get dangerous. Very dangerous. Sarah nodded, gripping his hand with surprising strength. I understand, and I'm prepared for whatever comes. As they sealed the deal, Max couldn't shake the feeling that he was signing more than just a contract. He was embarking on a journey that would change his life forever, if he survived to tell the tale. In the weeks that followed, Max dove headfirst into the investigation. Every lead he followed, every piece of information he unearthed, only deepened the mystery and increased the danger. He retraced Thomas Reeves's last movements, reconstructing the journalist's final days. He discovered secret meetings in dark alleys, whispered conversations in speakeasies, and everywhere, the name of the Order of Eternal Twilight loomed like a menacing shadow. It was during one of these nocturnal investigations that Max had his first real encounter with the danger he faced. He was following a lead in an abandoned warehouse when he heard footsteps behind him. Before he could react, he felt a sharp pain in the back of his head, and the world went dark. When he awoke, he was tied to a chair in a dark room. The only light came from candles arranged in a circle around him. And before him, dressed in black robes and silver masks, stood three imposing figures. Detective Holloway, the central figure spoke, their voice distorted by some kind of modulator. You have been very persistent in your quest, persistent and inconvenient. Max struggled against his bonds, his heart pounding in his chest. Who are you? What do you want? A cold laugh echoed through the room. We are the Order, Detective, and what we want is simple. We want you to stop. Abandon your investigation. Forget everything you have seen and heard. And if I refuse? Max challenged. Trying to keep his voice steady, the figure on the right stepped forward. Then I'm afraid we will have to take more drastic measures, just as we did with the unfortunate Mr. Reeves. Max's blood ran cold. It was the confirmation he feared. Thomas Reeves had been murdered. You won't get away with this, he growled. The truth will come out. The figure on the left laughed. Oh, Detective, we've been getting away with this for centuries. The Order has existed since the beginnings of this city. We are the shadows in the corridors of power, the whispers behind every major decision. Do you really think you can stop us? Max felt a chill run down his spine. The magnitude of what he was facing began to dawn on him. This was bigger than he imagined, older and more deeply rooted in the fabric of society. Think carefully, Mr. Holloway, the central figure spoke again. You have a choice to make. Abandon your quest and live, or continue and share the fate of Reeves. With a gesture, the figures turned to leave. The last thing Max saw before darkness engulfed him again was the sinister glint of the silver masks and the candlelight. When he woke, he was back in his apartment, with a pounding headache and a clear warning etched in his mind. But instead of intimidating him, the encounter only strengthened his resolve. Now he knew he was on the right track. The Order was real, and they were scared enough to try to stop him. That meant he was close to something big. With renewed determination, Max went back to work. He knew that every step now took him deeper into a labyrinth of secrets and dangers, but it also brought him closer to the truth, a truth for which Thomas Reeves had given his life. And as night fell over the city, Max Holloway prepared to delve even deeper into the shadows, determined to expose the secrets of the Order of Eternal Twilight, no matter the personal cost. The days that followed were a whirlwind of shocking discoveries and escalating dangers for Max Holloway. Each new lead he unearthed seemed to open a Pandora's box of dark secrets and conspiracies at the highest levels of society. One particularly cold night, Max found himself sifting through the dusty archives of the municipal library. It was there, hidden among ancient local history tomes, that he made a disturbing discovery. A worn book, its pages yellowed with age, recounted the city's founding. And there, in the margins of seemingly innocent accounts, Max began to see a pattern. Names he recognized from Thomas Reeves' files appeared repeatedly over the centuries. Not the same individuals, of course, but families. Lineages that seemed to be intertwined with the very fabric of the city's history. And in every generation, these names were linked to inexplicable events, mysterious deaths, and sudden rises to power. The Order isn't just ancient, Max murmured to himself, feeling a chill run down his spine. They've been here since the beginning. Armed with this new knowledge, Max intensified his investigation. He began mapping the connections, tracing lines from current politicians, business tycoons, and influential figures back to their ancestors who appeared in that old book. It was during this phase of his investigation that Max got his first real glimpse of the Order's sinister rituals. One night, following a lead from a nervous informant, he found himself on the outskirts of an isolated property at the city's edge. Hidden among the trees, Max watched in horror as hooded figures gathered in a circle in a clearing. In the center, tied to a stone altar, was a young woman, her muffled cries echoing through the night. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he fought the urge to intervene. He knew he couldn't do anything alone against so many, and that his best chance to help was to gather evidence to bring down the entire organization. With trembling hands, he raised his camera and started filming. What followed was a scene straight out of his darkest nightmares. The hooded figures chanted in a language Max didn't recognize, their voices rising in a terrifying crescendo. Then, at the chance climax, the group leader raised a ceremonial dagger. The blade glinted in the full moonlight before descending in a deadly arc. The woman's scream was abruptly silenced, and Max had to stifle his own scream of horror. But the worst was yet to come. As the victim's blood flowed across the stone altar, something began to change. The air seemed to thicken, charged with a malevolent energy. And then, for a brief moment, Max saw something. A dark, undefined form hovering above the circle of cultists. It was only for an instant, but it was enough to shake Max to his core. He had witnessed not just a murder, but something supernatural. Something that defied his understanding of the world. Trembling uncontrollably, Max retreated to the safety of the shadows, his brain struggling to process what he had just seen. He now understood why the Order was so powerful, so feared. They weren't just manipulating the corridors of earthly power. They were dealing with forces beyond human comprehension. In the days that followed, Max could barely sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that dark form, heard the woman's screams on the altar. But he knew he couldn't stop now. He was closer than ever to exposing the truth. With renewed determination, Max intensified his investigation. He began connecting the dots between the Order's rituals and significant events in the city. Crucial political decisions, million-dollar contracts, even seemingly natural disasters. Everything seemed somehow linked to the Order's dark activities. It was around this time that Max realized he was being followed. Shadows at the edges of his vision, cars that seemed always a little too close behind him in traffic. The Order was watching, waiting to make their next move. Max knew he was in a race against time. He needed to gather enough evidence to expose the Order before they caught up with him. But the more he investigated, the more dangerous the game became. One night, coming home after a long session of investigation, Max found his apartment ransacked. Every drawer had been emptied, every file rifled through, but the most disturbing thing was the symbol painted on the wall. A circle bisected by a diagonal line. The same symbol he had seen on the altar during the ritual. It was a clear message. The Order knew what he was doing, and they wouldn't tolerate it much longer. But Max couldn't stop now. He was too close. In his investigations, he had discovered something that could be the key to bringing down the entire organization, an imminent meeting of all the high-ranking members of the Order. It happened only once a decade, a ceremony to renew their vows and perform a ritual of great magnitude. And it was scheduled to happen in just 3 days. Max knew this was his chance. If he could infiltrate this meeting, obtain concrete proof of the Order's activities, he could expose everything. But he also knew it would be incredibly dangerous. If he got caught, there would be no second chance. With time running out, Max turned to the one person he still trusted, Sarah Reeves. Together, they devised a daring plan. Sarah would use her contacts in the media to prepare a live broadcast, ready to go on air the moment Max gave the signal. Meanwhile, Max would infiltrate the meeting, equipped with hidden cameras and recording devices. On the night of the meeting, Max's heart pounded as he approached the location, an old mansion on the outskirts of the city. Dressed in a stolen black robe and silver mask, he blended in with the crowd of Order members converging on the site. The mansion's interior was a labyrinth of dark hallways and ornate rooms. Max moved carefully, his cameras capturing every incriminating detail. He saw familiar faces behind the masks: politicians, judges, business leaders, people who should have been serving the public but who were instead serving a much more sinister agenda. Finally, the main ceremony began. In a large hall, hundreds of Order members gathered in a circle. In the center stood a familiar altar, the same kind Max had seen in the forest. The Order's leader, an imposing figure in a robe adorned with esoteric symbols, took his place. His voice, amplified somehow, echoed through the hall. "Brothers and sisters of the Order of Eternal Twilight, we gather once again to renew our pact with the forces beyond the veil. For centuries we have guided the destiny of this city, this country, this world, and today we will renew our power to continue our great work." Max felt his blood run cold. What was he about to witness? But before the ritual could begin, there was a commotion at the hall's entrance. Max turned, his heart nearly stopping as he saw Sarah being dragged in, struggling against her captors. "We found this intruder on the grounds," one of the guards announced. "She had broadcasting equipment." The Order's leader turned slowly, his silver mask reflecting the candlelight. "It seems we have an unexpected guest, and where there's one, there's surely another." Max felt all eyes turn to him. In a moment of panic, he activated the broadcast signal on his hidden equipment. If he was going down, at least the world would know the truth. "Ah, Detective Holloway," the leader spoke, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "You've been a thorn in our side for too long, but now you've given us a unique opportunity. 2 sacrifices for the price of 1. Guards advanced, grabbing Max and Sarah and dragging them to the center of the circle. Max struggled frantically, but it was useless. He could only hope the broadcast was working, that someone out there was seeing this. "You won't get away with this," Max shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. "The whole world is watching now." The Order's leader just laughed. "Oh, Detective, did you really think we didn't foresee this? At this very moment, all broadcast signals in the city are being jammed. Your little show is being seen only by us." Despair threatened to overwhelm Max. He had failed. Not only had he failed to expose the Order, but he had also condemned Sarah along with him. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the Order members, a shorter figure in the back rows, suddenly removed his mask. It was a face Max instantly recognized from Sarah's photos. Thomas Reeves. "Enough!" Thomas's voice thundered through the hall. "This ends now!" Chaos erupted. Confused Order members turned on each other, unsure of who to trust. Max seized the distraction to break free, pulling Sarah with him. In the frantic minutes that followed, Max, Sarah, and the resurrected Thomas fought their way out of the mansion. Alarms blared. Guards pursued them, but somehow, miraculously, they made it to Max's car. As they sped down the dark road, leaving the mansion behind, Max finally found his voice to ask the question burning in his mind. How are you alive?" Thomas, looking exhausted but determined, replied, "I faked my own death. It was the only way to infiltrate the highest levels of the Order. I knew they'd come after you, Max. I needed to be there for the right moment. Sarah, tears streaming down her face, hugged her brother. I thought I'd lost you. Max let the information sink in. They had escaped, yes, but the battle was far from over. The Order still existed, still held power. But now they had something they didn't have before, concrete proof of their activities. What do we do now? Sarah asked, her voice trembling but resolute. Max exchanged a look with Thomas in the rearview mirror. Now, he said, we expose everything. Every name, every ritual, every conspiracy, no matter the cost. As the car sped through the night, carrying them toward an uncertain future, Max knew that the real battle was just beginning. The Order of Eternal Twilight had been shaken, but it was not yet defeated, and he was determined to see this through to the end, no matter how dark the path ahead might be. The days following their escape from the mansion were a vivid nightmare for Max, Sarah, and Thomas. Holed up in a seedy motel on the outskirts of the city, they barely slept, haunted by horrific visions and inexplicable noises in the night. Thomas, still recovering from his infiltration of the Order, began exhibiting strange behaviors. Max caught him several times, muttering in an unknown language, his eyes rolling back in their sockets. Sarah tried to soothe him, but even she couldn't deny the growing fear she felt, looking at the brother she thought she had lost. As they organized the evidence, inexplicable events began to occur. Files disappeared only to reappear in impossible places. Shadows moved on the walls when no one was moving. And the smell? A putrid odor of decay seemed to emanate from the very walls, growing stronger each day. Max tried to focus on the task at hand, determined to expose the Order, but it was hard to ignore the terror settling in his bones. He began to question his own sanity. Had the Order done something to them during their escape? Or were the entities they invoked now haunting them? The plan for the live broadcast took shape amidst the growing chaos. Sarah managed to recruit a group of hackers, but Max couldn't help but notice the empty look in their eyes, as if something had been stripped from their souls. On the eve of the broadcast, as they made the final preparations, there was a knock at the door. It was Rodriguez, Max's former partner. His arrival brought a brief moment of relief, a connection to the normal world they had left behind. But as Rodriguez was brought up to speed, his face grew increasingly pale. "Max," he whispered, his voice trembling, "do you have any idea what you've unleashed? They're not just people. There's something more, something ancient and hungry." Before Max could question what Rodriguez meant, the lights flickered. For a moment, darkness swallowed everything. In that instant of total blackness, Max swore he heard whispers, thousands of voices speaking in unison in a language that made his blood run cold. When the lights came back on, Rodriguez had vanished. Where he had stood, only a pool of dark, viscous liquid remained, bubbling slowly as if it were alive. Panic set in, but there was no time to retreat. The broadcast had to go on. With trembling hands and racing hearts, they headed to the abandoned studio they had prepared. As the hour approached, the air grew heavier, laden with an almost palpable, malevolent energy. Sarah bled uncontrollably from her nose, her bloodshot eyes fixed on something only she could see. Thomas had curled up in a corner, babbling incoherently about the veil tearing. But Max persisted. At 8 p.m. sharp, he looked into the camera, his voice hoarse and tense. "Citizens, what you're about to see and hear will forever change the way you see our reality. For centuries, an organization known as the Order of Eternal Twilight has manipulated not just our lives, but the very fabric of reality." As Max spoke, exposing the meticulously collected evidence, chaos spread through the city. But it wasn't just the shock of the revelation. Reports began to pour in of inexplicable events happening everywhere. Statues wept blood. Children spoke in languages dead for millennia. And in the sky, the stars seemed to move, forming impossible patterns that drove observers mad. In the studio, things grew worse by the minute. Equipment started to melt, the metal flowing like wax. Sarah screamed uncontrollably, her eyes now completely black. Thomas had disappeared, leaving only his empty clothes behind. Max continued, desperate to finish the broadcast, to expose the truth. But as he reached the climax of his revelation, he realized his terrible mistake. The Order wasn't just summoning entities. They were containing something ancient, vast, and indifferent to humanity. And by exposing the Order, by weakening their control, Max had inadvertently unleashed this unspeakable horror. The walls of the studio began to contort, impossible shapes emerging from solidity. The air grew dense, filled with the whispers of millions of agonizing voices. "My God," Max choked out, looking directly into the camera, tears of blood streaming down his face. "What have we done?" The broadcast cut off abruptly, leaving millions of viewers horrified and confused. In the streets, chaos reigned. Portals opened in the very air, revealing nightmare landscapes and unspeakable horrors. In the days that followed, society collapsed. Governments fell, armies were annihilated by forces that defied comprehension. Reality bent and twisted, the laws of physics becoming mere suggestions. Max, Sarah, and Thomas were never seen again. Some say they were the first victims, consumed by the entities they had inadvertently released. Others claim to have seen them, transformed into something no longer human, wandering the ruins of civilization. The truth they had so desperately sought to expose proved to be more terrible than they could have imagined. The Order of Eternal Twilight, with all its crimes and horrors, was actually humanity's last line of defense against something far, far worse. And now, as darkness engulfs the world and unimaginable horrors roam freely, the few survivors wonder if the knowledge was worth the price. If perhaps some truth should remain buried, some veils never lifted. In the eternally darkened sky, strange and malevolent stars shine, forming the symbol of the Order. A constant reminder of the balance that was disturbed, of the Pandora's box that was opened. And somewhere, beyond the veil of sanity, Max Holloway screams eternally, begging for a forgiveness that will never come. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with blood-red hues as Detective Jack Thorne stepped onto Blackmore Island for the first time. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and something else, something putrid he couldn't identify. The waves crashed against the black rocks of the coast with unusual violence, as if the sea itself wanted to keep him away. Jack adjusted the strap of his backpack, feeling the weight of the responsibilities he carried. 15 tourists had disappeared on this remote island in the past 2 weeks. 15 lives depended on his skills to be found. The local sheriff, a burly man named Bill Hawkins, waited for him on the small wooden pier. "Welcome to Blackmore, Detective," Hawkins said, his gruff voice competing with the roar of the waves. "Though I wish it were under better circumstances." Jack nodded, studying the sheriff's face. There was something in his eyes, a fear he tried to hide. "Tell me more about the disappearances," Jack asked as they began walking toward the village. Hawkins sighed heavily. "It started 2 weeks ago. A group of tourists, 12 in total, came for a hike in the forest. They were supposed to return the next day, but never did. We sent out search teams, but found nothing, not even a footprint." Jack frowned. "And the other 3? A honeymoon couple and their guide disappeared 3 days ago while exploring the ancient ruins in the center of the island." As they approached the village, Jack noticed the oppressive silence hanging over the place. The windows of the houses were shut, the streets empty. The few residents he saw looked at him with a mix of hope and fear. "People are scared," Hawkins explained, noticing Jack's gaze. "Blackmore has always had its dark legends, but now they seem more real than ever." Jack was about to ask for more details when a sharp scream cut through the air. They turned just in time to see an elderly woman stumbling out of one of the houses, her eyes wide with terror. "She came back!" the woman screamed, pointing to the second-floor window. "My Sarah came back, but she's not the same." Jack and Hawkins ran to the house, taking the stairs 2 at a time. In the second-floor bedroom, they found a scene that chilled Jack's blood. A young girl stood by the window, her back to them. Her long, dark hair was tangled with leaves and twigs, her clothes torn and stained with mud. Slowly, she turned around. Jack stifled a gasp. The girl's face was waxy pale, her eyes completely white, with no iris or pupil. An unnatural smile stretched from ear to ear, revealing sharp teeth like those of an animal. "Welcome," she said, her voice a grotesque mix of whispers and screams. "The island calls you. The forest awaits you." Before Jack or Hawkins could react, the girl jumped out of the window. They rushed to look, expecting to see a broken body on the sidewalk below. But there was nothing. No sign of the girl, not even a drop of blood. "My God," Hawkins murmured, his face pale with shock. "That was Sarah Collins. She disappeared 5 years ago." Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. What the hell was happening on this island? In the hours that followed, Jack threw himself into the investigation. He interviewed residents, studied maps of the island, and reviewed the reports of previous disappearances. A pattern began to emerge, one that made his stomach turn. All the disappearances had one thing in common: the forest. That dense, dark mass of trees covering most of the island seemed to be the epicenter of the entire mystery. As night fell, Jack found himself sitting in the local bar, the only place in the village that still showed signs of life. The hum of conversations was punctuated by occasional nervous glances at the windows, as if everyone expected to see pale faces and white eyes watching them from the darkness. It was there that Jack met Old Tom, a retired fisherman with more wrinkles than a topographic map, and eyes that seemed to have seen things no man should see. "You want to know about the forest, don't you?" Old Tom said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "I'll tell you, boy, that forest is older than time. It holds secrets that are better left buried." Jack leaned forward, intrigued. "What kind of secrets?" Old Tom looked around nervously before leaning closer. "They say that long ago, before the settlers came, this island was home to an ancient people. They practiced dark magic, made pacts with things that shouldn't exist." Jack felt a shiver run down his spine, but forced himself to maintain a skeptical expression. "And what happened to these people?" The old fisherman took a long swig of his drink before answering. "The settlers massacred them. Men, women, children, all dead. But they say that before they died, the elders cast a curse. They swore that one day they would return to take revenge, to claim what was rightfully theirs." Jack was about to dismiss the story as local superstition when a sudden tremor shook the bar. Bottles rattled on the shelves, glasses slid across tables, and then, as quickly as it began, it stopped. A deadly silence fell over the place, broken only by the distant sound of something Jack couldn't identify. It was like a chant, but unlike anything he had ever heard before. It was ancient, primal, and made every hair on his body stand on end. "It's starting," Old Tom whispered, his face a mask of terror. "They're coming back." At that moment, the bar's lights flickered and went out, plunging everyone into darkness. Panicked screams echoed through the room, but Jack barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on the window, where he could swear he saw, for a brief instant, dozens of white eyes glowing in the night, watching him. When the lights came back on seconds later, Jack was already on his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what he had to do. As much as his instinct screamed to flee, to catch the next boat to the mainland, he couldn't abandon those missing people. "Sheriff," he called, spotting Hawkins in the middle of the frightened crowd. "We need to organize an expedition. We're going into the forest at dawn." Hawkins looked at him as if he had gone mad. "You can't be serious. After all this?" Jack nodded grimly. "It's precisely because of all this that we need to go. Whatever's happening, the answer is in that forest. And those people, if they're still alive, need our help." The sheriff hesitated for a long moment before finally agreeing with a reluctant nod. "God help us," he murmured. As Jack prepared for the night, gathering equipment and studying maps, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of something far larger and more terrible than he had ever imagined. The island's legends, the disappearances, the girl with white eyes, everything pointed to an ancient and sinister mystery. And tomorrow, he would dive headfirst into that mystery, venturing into a forest that seemed determined to keep its secrets. Jack knew that whatever he found there would change his life forever. He just hoped to survive to tell the tale. Outside his window, the wind howled, carrying that distant, alien chant. And in the shadows of the night, something moved, watched, and waited. Blackmore Island had kept its secrets for centuries, and it wouldn't give them up easily. Dawn arrived with a thick, clinging fog that enveloped the island like a shroud. Jack Thorne adjusted the backpack on his shoulders, feeling the weight of provisions, search equipment, and his weapon. Beside him, Sheriff Hawkins and 3 local volunteers prepared for the expedition into the forest. Their faces were tense, eyes constantly scanning the trees as if expecting something to leap out at them at any moment. "Last chance to back out," Jack said, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. No one moved. With a nod, the group began their journey to the heart of the island. The forest swallowed them quickly. Sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, creating an eternal twilight on the forest floor. The air was humid and heavy, laden with the smell of decaying vegetation and something else, something that made Jack's stomach churn. They walked for hours, the vegetation becoming denser and more twisted with each step. Jack noticed strange symbols carved into the trees, spirals, eyes, shapes that seemed to move when looked at from the corner of the eye. "What the hell are these?" one of the volunteers, a man named Mike, asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Old markings," Hawkins replied, his face pale. "They say the natives use them to keep something at bay." Jack was about to ask for more details when a sharp scream cut through the air. They all turned, weapons ready, to see Mike being dragged into the darkness by something. It happened so fast that Jack barely had time to register what he saw. A tangle of branches and roots moving like tentacles, wrapping around Mike and pulling him into the shadows. "Mike!" Hawkins yelled, running towards the sound. The others followed, panic rising in their chests. They found Mike minutes later, or what was left of him. His body was wrapped in a cocoon of roots and moss, only his face visible. His eyes were open, white and lifeless, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. Jack approached cautiously, his heart pounding. When he touched the cocoon, it pulsed under his fingers, as if it were alive. "My God," one of the other volunteers moaned, vomiting into the nearby bushes. Jack forced himself to examine the scene more closely. That's when he noticed something glinting in Mike's half-closed hand. Carefully, he pried open the rigid fingers. It was a piece of metal, some kind of medallion. On it was the same symbol Jack had seen carved into the trees, an eye within a spiral. "This isn't natural," Hawkins murmured, his voice trembling. "We should go back, call for reinforcements." Jack shook his head. "There's no time. If what happened to Mike can happen to the missing tourists." He didn't need to finish the sentence. With one last look at Mike's body, the group moved on, now more cautious than ever. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the environment around them seemed to change subtly. The trees appeared to twist and move when they weren't looking directly at them. Strange sounds echoed in the distance, whispers, laughter, muffled screams. Jack consulted his GPS, frowning. "This doesn't make sense. According to this, we're walking in circles." "Impossible," Hawkins said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We've been walking in a straight line for hours." That's when Jack noticed something strange. The shadows around them. They didn't match the position of the sun. In fact, they seemed to move independently, lengthening and contracting as if they were breathing. One of the volunteers screamed, pointing. In the darkness between the trees, white eyes gleamed, dozens of them, silently watching. "Run!" Jack shouted, his instincts taking over. They ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping their faces, roots trying to grab their feet. The sounds around them intensified. Screams, maniacal laughter, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Jack didn't know how long they ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed distorted in this cursed place. Finally, they burst into a clearing and stopped abruptly, panting. Before them stood an ancient structure, a circle of moss-covered megalithic stones with carved symbols. In the center of the circle, a stone altar stained dark red. "What is this place?" one of the volunteers whispered, his voice thick with fear. Jack cautiously approached the altar, his stomach turning at what he saw. On the stone were scratch marks, as if someone, or something, had fought desperately. Scattered around were small personal items, a watch, a wedding ring, a broken camera. "The tourists were here," Jack said, his voice hoarse. Hawkins stepped closer, his eyes wide with horror. Is this a sacrificial site?" Before Jack could respond, a sound echoed through the clearing, a low, rhythmic chanting that made their hair stand on end. From the shadows between the trees, figures began to emerge. They were people, or at least they had been. Their bodies were covered in moss and fungi, branches and roots sprouting from their flesh. Their eyes were white and vacant, their mouths twisted into inhuman smiles. Jack recognized some of them from the missing persons posters, the tourists, or what was left of them. "Welcome," a voice echoed, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You've arrived just in time for the harvest." From the center of the stone circle, a figure materialized. It was tall, its body a twisted mass of roots and flesh, crowned by a head that was more animal than human. Its eyes gleamed with ancient, malevolent intelligence. What are you?" Jack asked, his hand tightening on his gun. The creature laughed, a sound like snapping branches. "I am the Guardian, the Protector, the Avenger. I am the voice of those who were silenced, the arm of long overdue justice." He gestured to the figures around them. "These are my children now, those who came to explore, to conquer, to desecrate. Now they serve a greater purpose." Jack felt the blood freeze in his veins. "The tourists. What did you do to them?" The Guardian smiled, revealing teeth as sharp as fangs. "I freed them from their weak, corrupt humanity. Now they are part of the forest, part of something greater and older than your fleeting civilization." Hawkins stepped forward, his gun trembling in his hands. "Let them go, you freak." The Guardian just laughed again. With a gesture, roots erupted from the ground, grabbing Hawkins and the remaining volunteers. They screamed, struggling in vain against the vegetal appendages dragging them into the shadows. Jack fired his gun, the bullets passing through the Guardian's body without effect. The creature didn't even blink. "Fool," it hissed. "Your weapons have no power here. This is our realm, our domain, and you, Jack Thorne, will be our final offering." The roots advanced on Jack, who dodged and ran. He zigzagged between the megalithic stones, the sound of supernatural pursuers close behind. In his desperation, Jack stumbled and fell. When he turned, he saw the Guardian looming over him, a hand outstretched. "Don't fight," the creature whispered. "Embrace your destiny. Become part of something greater." Jack felt something move in his mind, an ancient and vast presence trying to overwhelm his will. Visions of primordial forests, of ancient bloody rituals flooded his consciousness. With superhuman effort, Jack resisted. His hand found something on the ground. The medallion he had taken from Mike. The moment his fingers touched the metal, a wave of energy coursed through his body. The Guardian recoiled, hissing in pain. Jack stood up, holding the medallion like a shield. "This ends now," he growled. The Guardian laughed, but there was a note of uncertainty in its voice. "You cannot stop us. We are ancient. We are eternal. We are the very earth." But Jack could feel the power flowing through the medallion. Somehow, he knew what he had to do. With a cry of defiance, he ran toward the altar at the center of the circle. The Guardian and its creatures tried to stop him, but the medallion kept them at bay. Jack reached the altar and, following an instinct he didn't fully understand, pressed the medallion against the blood-stained stone. A blinding flash of light erupted, followed by a scream that seemed to come from the earth itself. Jack felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, trees twisting and cracking around him. When the light dimmed and his eyes adjusted, Jack saw that he was alone in the clearing. The Guardian, the creatures, everything had vanished. Only the megalithic stones remained, now cracked and toppled. Exhausted and stunned, Jack stumbled through the forest. Hours later, he emerged on the beach, where a rescue team found him. In the days that followed, search teams combed the island. They found Hawkins and the other volunteers, disoriented, but alive. The missing tourists were located in various parts of the forest, confused and unable to remember what had happened to them. The official story spoke of mass hallucinations caused by rare fungal spores. But Jack knew the truth. He could feel, in his bones, that the threat wasn't over. It was merely dormant. As he boarded the ferry to leave the island, Jack looked back one last time. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw a tall, distorted figure at the edge of the forest, watching him. A silent reminder that some secrets are better left buried. and that the line between myth and reality is thinner than we would like to believe. 6 months had passed since the terrifying events on Blackmore Island, but for Jack Thorne, the nightmare was far from over. Every night, he was haunted by vivid dreams of trees writhing like serpents, white eyes gleaming in the darkness, and the Guardian's cavernous voice echoing in his mind. "You cannot stop us. We are eternal." Jack had tried to move on, return to his normal life as a detective in the big city. But the medallion he had brought from the island, that enigmatic symbol of an eye within a spiral, seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, constantly reminding him of the horror he had faced. It was on a particularly restless night, with the full moon hanging ominously in the sky, that Jack received the call that would change everything again. "Detective Thorne?" The voice on the other end was trembling, almost a whisper. "This is Sarah Collins, from Blackmore Island." Jack felt his blood run cold. Sarah Collins, the girl who had disappeared for 5 years, only to reappear as a nightmare creature with white eyes and sharp teeth. "How did you get my number?" Jack asked, his hand instinctively reaching for the medallion around his neck. "It doesn't matter," Sarah replied, her voice now laden with urgency. "You need to come back. It's happening again. The cult, they're trying to bring him back." Before Jack could ask more, the line went dead. He tried calling back, but only got a message saying the number didn't exist. With his heart racing, Jack knew he had no choice. He had to return to the island to face the terror he had left behind once more. 2 days later, Jack disembarked once again at Blackmore's small pier. The island's atmosphere seemed even more oppressive than before. The sky was covered by dark, low clouds, and a cold wind blew from the sea, carrying the smell of decay. The village was nearly deserted. The few people Jack saw hurried through the streets with their eyes downcast, avoiding eye contact. The windows of the houses were closed and locked, many of them hastily painted with protection symbols. Jack headed to the police station, hoping to find Sheriff Hawkins, but the building was empty, a thin layer of dust covering the desks and files. "He's gone," a raspy voice said behind him. Jack turned to see Old Tom, the old fisherman, standing in the doorway. His face was more wrinkled than ever, his eyes sunken and haunted. "Hawkins. He went into the forest 3 days ago. He hasn't come back." Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. "What's happening here, Tom?" The old fisherman nervously glanced over his shoulder before answering. "It's the cult. They've always been here, hiding in the shadows. But now they're doing something big." "What cult?" Jack pressed, recalling Sarah's mention on the phone. "The children of the ancient tree," Tom whispered, as if afraid the very walls might hear him. "They worship the spirits of the forest, the ancients, and now they think they can bring them back completely." Jack felt the medallion on his neck pulse as if responding to Tom's words. "Where can I find them?" Tom shook his head vigorously. No, you don't understand. They're everywhere. They could be anyone. Your neighbors, your friends, even your family." At that moment, a sharp scream pierced the air, coming from the direction of the beach. Jack ran outside, Old Tom hobbling behind him. On the beach, a crowd had gathered. In the center, a woman writhed in the sand, screaming in agony. Jack pushed his way through the crowd and was horrified by what he saw. The woman's skin was moving as if something were writhing beneath it. Suddenly, her skin burst open, and branches began sprouting from her body, leaves and flowers blooming from her flesh. "It's starting," someone in the crowd murmured. "The transformation." Jack stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to do something, to stop whatever was happening. But how? Then he noticed Sarah Collins on the edge of the crowd. Her eyes were no longer white, but filled with fear and determination. She made a subtle gesture for Jack to follow her, and then disappeared into the forest. Against his better judgment, Jack followed. They plunged into the forest, which seemed even more alive and threatening than before. The trees seemed to bend over them, their branches reaching out like bony fingers. "Why did you bring me back?" Jack demanded when he finally caught up to Sarah. "Because you're the only one who can stop them," she replied, her voice urgent. "The medallion. It chose you. You're the only one who can seal the portal." "Portal? What portal?" Sarah pointed to the heart of the forest, the stone circle. It's a portal to the realm of the ancients. The cult believes they can open it completely, bringing the spirits back to our world. But if they do, she didn't need to finish. Jack could imagine the chaos and horror that would follow if the creatures he had glimpsed were unleashed upon the world. Together, they hurried through the forest, constantly feeling unseen eyes watching them. The sounds around them were a cacophony of whispers, laughter, and distant screams. When they reached the clearing of the stone circle, the scene that awaited them was pure nightmare. Dozens of cultists in dark green robes were gathered around the central altar. In the center, tied and bleeding, was Sheriff Hawkins. A tall man with a carved wooden mask stood over the altar, a ceremonial dagger raised. "With this sacrifice," he intoned, his voice unnaturally resonant, "we open the way for our masters." Jack acted on instinct. He ran into the clearing, the medallion glowing with a supernatural light. The cultists turned, shouting in shock and anger. "Stop," Jack yelled. "You don't know what you're doing." The cult leader laughed, a sound that made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stand on end. "Oh, but we know exactly what we're doing, Detective. We're bringing back the balance. Nature will reclaim what is rightfully hers." With a swift motion, he brought the dagger down. Hawkins' scream was drowned out by the deafening roar that followed. The air in the clearing seemed to tear open, revealing a vortex of pulsing darkness. Monstrous forms began to emerge, creatures that were a grotesque fusion of plant and flesh, their bodies contorted and their eyes glowing with an ancient and malevolent intelligence. Jack felt panic threatening to overwhelm him, but the medallion around his neck pulsed with a warm and comforting energy. Somehow, he knew what he needed to do. Running to the altar, Jack raised the medallion. "I seal this portal," he shouted, his voice filled with a power he didn't fully understand. "By the power of the ancient guardians, I command you to close." The medallion blazed with a blinding light. The cultists screamed, some falling to their knees, others trying to flee. The creatures that had begun to emerge from the portal howled in fury and pain, being sucked back into the vortex. The cult leader charged at Jack, the dagger raised. "You cannot stop us," he roared. "We are the voice of nature, the wrath of the earth." But before he could reach Jack, roots erupted from the ground, wrapping around the cult leader. He screamed in agony as he was dragged into the closing portal. With a deafening crash, the vortex closed. The clearing fell silent, broken only by the sound of Jack's ragged breathing and the groans of the fallen cultists. Sarah ran to Jack, her eyes wide with awe. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." But Jack knew the victory was only temporary. Deep down, he could feel that the threat wasn't over. The portal was sealed, but for how long? In the weeks that followed, Blackmore Island slowly began to recover. The cult members were arrested, and teams of specialists came to investigate the strange events. Jack knew he could never tell the whole truth. Who would believe in interdimensional portals and vengeful nature spirits? The official story spoke of a radical environmental cult using hallucinogens to manipulate people. But at night, when the wind blew through the trees and the moon cast strange shadows, Jack knew the real battle was just beginning. The medallion around his neck was a constant reminder that there are forces in the world beyond our understanding, and that the line between the natural and the supernatural is thinner than we'd like to believe. As he watched the sun set over Blackmore one last time before leaving, Jack made a silent promise. He would stay vigilant, ready to face the horror again if necessary. Because now he knew, some secrets are best left buried, but when unearthed, they must be confronted no matter the cost. And in the forest, in the deepest shadows where light never reaches, something stirs. It waits, and it plans its return.